Hi everyone, Adrian here, welcome back to ALTERKNIT. Now it's no secret that Brooklyn Tweed is one of the big names in the premium yarn space. Today I'm going to be doing a review of their product Loft. Brooklyn Tweed was founded in 2006 in New York by Jared Flood, who's a young and really talented designer who relocated the business to Portland, Oregon, where the distribution center and their HQ is now. He first started out with just one yarn product, and that was Shelter. And the range has now grown to include Loft, that I'm reviewing today, Quarry, which is a chunky yarn, Plains, which is, I guess, kind of like a capsule collection, and their latest edition, Arbor, which is a worsted weight yarn. I haven't actually completed a garment in this yarn, but I have been knitting with it for a lot of months, too many months actually. I've been a bit slow with this project. So I'm not going to be reviewing Brooklyn Tweed per se, just Brooklyn Tweed Loft, which is their fingering weight yarn, because that's the only thing that I really have experience with so far. I do need to say that this video isn't being sponsored at all. These are just my opinions on the yarn. I don't like to do first impressions. I like to work with the product before I give it a bit of a review. So let's get started. Okay, so as I say, I don't have a completed garment to show you, but I do have panels that I have knitted in this wonderful yarn. And I'll show you, this is just a panel of a project called Redford, and it's a kind of like a pullover shirt by Julie Hoover. I can link the pattern down below. So this is it. I'm gonna stick it in front of my face for the time being. You might see there's a bit of paper connected to it, and that's just so that I remember which panel it is. But that's sort of, I'll do some closer up views of the yarn as well. Now the fiber, this is a wool yarn, and the fiber is Targhee Columbia wool. This was exciting for me. It was a complete departure from anything that I had knit with before. Most of the products that I have used have been in merino wool. Targhee Columbia is a crossbreed of the Targhee and the Columbia wool, one of which I think the Targhee is actually very similar to merino, but the Columbia has a lot more loft and springiness and crimp to it. It is a relatively young breed, and these sheep are grown in Wyoming. And this is one thing that I really love about Brooklyn Tweed, is if you want to know what sheep are used, where the sheep are grown, where they're shorn, where the wool is dyed, where it's spun, all of that, you know, they're very transparent about the processes, which makes me feel really comfortable about using them. And Brooklyn Tweed does say that they like to support the wool industry in the US, which I think is really admirable. So in terms of production, this yarn is woolen spun, and I'll link you to videos that will sort of describe the difference between woolen spun and worsted spun. It's spun in New Hampshire, I believe, and dyed in Philadelphia. The yarn itself comes in a 50-gram skein, which is 275 yards, and it is a 2-plied fingering weight yarn. 2-ply is really interesting in that sometimes it can create really nice flat stitches. So it's really great for stockinette, amongst other things like lace. It is a tweedy yarn, or a heathered yarn, and it does kind of have a natural thick and thin component to it as well. Nothing so outlandish that if you do knit a panel of stockinette that you can really see thin segments and thick segments. It's a bit more subtle than that, but it still creates a really uniform fabric. It also comes in 37 colors, which is a pretty big color range, but it's also a very well considered color range and has a great neutral palettes, and there are some really bright colors as well, which is clever because you can use this yarn to knit for the winter. You can also use it to knit for sort of less cold seasons that you might have if you want a bit of color. I'm not really going to discuss the price in exact terms because, you know, conversion rates will differ over time, and you know, the availability will affect the price, but I will say that it is probably for your moderate to high budget. It's not a lower end, it's not a cheaper yarn. So just keep that in mind if you are doing a big project, that you probably will lay out a bit more money than you were expecting, but it is actually, personally I find that it's worth paying the extra money for this product. As I'll talk about soon, it's just sort of nothing that I've ever worked with before. It's like nothing I've worked with before. I kind of struggle to describe how it feels in the skein. When I first picked it up, and if you watch closely to one of my unboxing videos where I unboxed this yarn, I could see surprise scud across my face as I picked it up, because it just didn't even feel like anything else I'd felt before. The skein was very light, lighter than it looked it would be. And it didn't sort of flop and move. It just moved as one unit. And that surprised me because I hadn't felt anything like that before. It did feel slightly coarse to the hand as well. The impression I got when I picked up the skein was that I could probably use this against my skin, but those with sensitive skin probably wouldn't want to use it right next to the skin. They'd want a barrier, a garment, an undergarment of some kind. It was very easy to wind by hand. It's the only way I can really describe this yarn is that it's really quite sticky. If you've watched my video talking about the anatomy of wool, you'll know that there are scales on the outside of the wool fiber that help it to felt and stick together, and that's why it can be spun. I feel like, I mean, I haven't seen this wool under a microscope or anything, but I feel like it's got pretty big scales on it for it to stick to itself the way it does. So winding the skeins by hand is really easy because wherever the yarn strand falls as you're winding it around your dowel or carton or whatever it is you're doing, it just stays where you place it. So it's really pleasant to actually hand wind. There are other yarns that I've hand wound that will start slipping off and I'll eventually have to take it off and make it into a ball, and it annoys me. So this was really pleasant to wind by hand. It does feel really airy when you're using it. And this is because it's a true woolen spun yarn. I think up until the point that I was using Brooklyn Tweed, I was quite confused as to which wools were woolen spun and which were worsted spun. And very quickly, worsted spun means that the fibers are very combed, you know, so that they're very unidirectional. They're all lying in the same way. And so that when they're spun, you create a lot smoother and sometimes more durable yarn. Whereas woolen spun, the fibers are combed in the same direction, but not as much as with worsted spun. What results with a true woolen spun yarn is that it is quite light and airy. It also has greater air pocket space within the fibers. As you wear the garment against your skin, your own body heat will warm the air that is trapped between those wool fibers, and it actually can create a much warmer garment for you. Plus it has a slightly more rustic feel to it, and that's something that I very much adore about the Brooklyn Tweed Loft, is that it isn't such a slick looking yarn. It does look a little bit more like it's been hand spun, which it hasn't been. It is a mill spun yarn. With regard to knots and vegetable matter, I have knit with 8 skeins of this yarn, and I encountered a knot in the middle of one skein. But because this is truly woolen spun and it's so easy to spit splice or, you know, hand felt it back together, it really wasn't a drama for me. Vegetable matter, there has been some small amounts. They don't bother me at all. It's not as though there are big chunks of grass or bark or hay in these yarns. It's just very fine pieces of vegetable matter. And in fact, the reason that there is a little bit more vegetable matter supposedly in Loft or in the Brooklyn Tweed yarns in general is that they forego the carbonization step, which is to submerge the yarn in an industrial acid, which then sort of dissolves away the vegetable matter. They feel that it does sort of decrease the quality of the wool, and so that skip is stepped. And you can easily get rid of vegetable matter if there is some after blocking. So I don't really see that as a big deal. Another great property of this yarn is that it is gauge flexible, and that you can knit it on US 0 to US 6, which is 2 to 4 millimeter needles. And that is going to determine what the kind of fabric is like, pretty much with every other yarn. But some are not as forgiving with their gauge. If you do knit it on tighter on smaller needles, you will get a very sturdy, dense fabric when you block it. If you knit it on larger needles, that's probably best for open work or lace work, projects where you're going to put eyelets in or yarn overs, which I think is great because not everyone has a huge range of needles. All right, so this is the part of Brooklyn Tweed Loft that gets so many complaints. And if you have looked up yarn reviews or comments on the yarn page for Brooklyn Tweed Loft on Ravalery, you'll see that there are quite a lot of comments, and a lot of them are people complaining about how fragile this yarn is. And yes, this yarn is incredibly fragile. However, I will preface all of this by saying I've never accidentally broken this yarn once. It has never snapped or come apart for me at all. Even in some of the thin segments, which let me tell you can get incredibly thin, and it does sort of put a bead of sweat on the brow when you're knitting with the thin segments. But I've hand wound this yarn into cakes, and I've knit with it, and I'm a pretty tight knitter generally. A lot of the comments on Ravelry will say that even with gentle handling, the yarn falls to pieces, and it also falls to pieces after blocking. Now I have knit all but one panel of a jumper, and I've blocked all of these panels, and there hasn't been any problem for me. And as I say, I've used 8 different skeins of this yarn. On the website, Brooklyn Tweed will say that a gentler hand is needed to use Loft. And I think that it's a small price to pay, even some breakages are a small price to pay for the quality of the product that you get. If you're expecting something that is uniform and is smooth and is soft, this isn't the yarn for you. If you want something that is very fine and delicate, light and airy and a little bit rustic to the feel, this is an excellent product for you. And just be mindful that it does require gentler handling. I was terrified when I ordered this yarn because I had read all of these reviews beforehand thinking, okay, well, I'm a really tight knitter. What is this going to mean for me? Maybe I could knit stockinette, but could I do things like knit 2 together or knit through the back loop? That might require a little bit more stretching of the yarn. One thing I've noticed about the yarn breaking, because I have tested its strength before, is that if you repeatedly tug in the same area, it definitely does not like that. It can take 1 or 2 gentle tugs, but if you give it a good pull or if you tug it a few times, it will come apart. And this is mainly because the staple length of the yarn, or the length of the fibers, is quite short, and it doesn't have a huge amount of twist to it because it is wool and spun yarn. And that's why it's a little more fragile. Apart from that, knitting with it is actually a real pleasure. It sort of helps me to keep my arms and shoulders and hands nice and relaxed, and it makes because I don't want to tear it to pieces, and it makes the experience of knitting a lot more relaxing for me. It is quite coarse, but it doesn't fight against the skin of your hands. It doesn't irritate the skin on your hands, is what I have found with knitting with this product. It has an excellent stitch definition. Excellent stitch definition. Even with a dark color, I'm using cast iron, it's a charcoal gray. It's probably a deep charcoal gray with flecks of light gray through it. I'm terrible with colors. But I can still see each stitch really well. In terms of what you would use this yarn to knit, I really think anything would be, well, I guess this is probably not a yarn for socks, okay, because it is so delicate. I would also suggest using it for homewares like pillow cushions, or blankets for, using on the couch. Probably not the best idea. For baby blankets, for, garments, accessories, scarves, hats, those sorts of things, it's perfect for. Washing and blocking. Okay, so the website suggests that it does need to be submerged for a few minutes and wet blocked. I don't really do any other form of blocking or washing. I do wash all of my yarns in hair conditioner. I feel like it helps soften them a little bit more after the blocking process. But this yarn is interesting. It changes completely when it's blocked. It does feel very fragile when you're knitting with it and in a knitted panel. But when you block that panel, the yarn seems to stick together. And I think it is because, as I said previously, it's quite a sticky yarn, but it sticks together, it coheres and becomes a really uniform piece of fabric that seems a bit more durable than it was before it went through the blocking process. It's a very interesting thing to see, but it's very pleasant, and it didn't distort out of shape. It certainly didn't break at all. None of the color leached out really. There's a slight sort of gray tinge to the water afterwards, but we are talking about sort of slightly more eco-friendly wool dyes that aren't necessarily incredibly color fast. The drape of the actual panel after it is blocked is a lot more fluid than when it's just knit together, which is typical of most yarns anyway. What do I think of this yarn in general? It's fantastic. I was only planning to use it for this one project, and I was going to use a different yarn to knit a couple of jumpers for my mum. I don't really know what that was. For my mum and my sister, but it is and it's a Brooklyn Tweed pattern that calls for Brooklyn Tweed yarn. I'm going to knit it in the Brooklyn Tweed yarn now because I'm so comfortable with using it. One thing I will say is that the pattern, at least the Redford by Julie Hoover, suggests that you don't seam up with Loft. They pretty much say outright, this is not going to hold up as a seam. So do have a different yarn for that that's going to give it a bit more structural integrity. Even though the price is a little bit higher than probably what you're used to for most 50 gram wool products like this, I do think it is definitely worth the money. I think anything that enriches your knitting experience, whether it be just that tactile experience of the wool. I mean, that's pretty much a big part of why we do this, isn't it? I mean, I know it is for me. I'm not going to speak for you. I'm just going to show you some close-ups of the wool, and that's pretty much it for my review. I definitely give it, 5 whatevers out of whatever. I don't know, 5 skeins out of 5, or I'm not going to give it. It's just brilliant. Use it. I think that if you are tossing up whether or not to try this yarn, I think definitely go for it, even if it's to use it for an accessory. If you want to get a couple of skeins and do some hats or whatever, get a whole bunch to do a jumper. I think it's worth it. As long as we're being mindful about what it is we want the finished product to look like. If you do want something that has a really rustic, romantic feel to it, buy this yarn. If you want polished and perfect and machine knit, maybe look at Arbor. I haven't used Arbor, but it is Brooklyn Tweed's newest product, and it is a worsted spun, their first worsted spun product, which is not heathered, it's solid colors. So that might be something that you could check out. But anyway, look, thanks very much for joining me for this review. I hope it's been helpful for you. If you have any comments about what would be helpful for future product reviews, particularly with yarn reviews, please leave it in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed, please do so you don't miss any notifications from when I upload a new video. But bye for now.